The subject of this debate is one that ought to be important to each one of us. Tonight we will be looking at two different worldviews, Christian and atheist, and examining how these two perspectives view morality. What are the origins of morality? Is there a shared morality that we all hold to? If not, how do we determine which morality is correct and which worldview is better for society? Whose morality should be given priority in public policy? Tonight's dialogue is hosted by two different clubs. Power to Change is a club that aims to change the world by helping students discover Jesus. The vision of Power to Change is that no student would graduate without engaging with the life-changing message of Jesus Christ. Power to Change encourages students to ask and discuss the big questions in life, questions of origin, morality, meaning, and destiny, questions which are often missed in the classroom setting. The University of Toronto Secular Alliance is a club that aims to build community for those adhering to secular worldviews, humanists, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, freethinkers, etc. It's both political and philosophical in nature, discussing everything from issues like assisted euthanasia to education issues in modern secular states. So our two speakers for tonight are Mike Ivanov and Peter Kupish. So Mike Ivanov is the current University of Toronto Secular Alliance president. He's a history specialist going into OISE to pursue his Master's of Teaching. He also happens to be a national chess master and teacher representing Canada in Olympiads and World Youth Championships. Mike likes to discuss issues of importance to students at University of Toronto and would like to create an atmosphere of intellectual discussion on campus. Peter Kupish has an MA in Philosophy of Religion and Ethics from Biola University and a Master's in the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology from the University of Toronto. He worked as an adjunct professor of philosophy at Biola University and as a full-time instructor at Dongju College in South Korea. He enjoys discussing and dialoguing the most pressing issues of our day on Facebook and in real life. Finally, our moderator for tonight will be Cameron Proctor. Cameron is the Emeritus Vice President of the UTSA, husband, and a senior PhD in physical geography at the University of Toronto, where he studies below carbon deposition and methanogenesis. For the past several years, Cameron has studied the arguments for and against theism, yet finds more comfort in science, empiricism, and the human condition. An avid cyclist and science fiction consumer, Cameron finds little time for these activities as he pursues his academic career. Before we begin this dialogue, I'll give you a brief outline of the night. The moderator, Cameron, will pose 3 questions to the speakers. After each question, Mike and Peter will both have 5 minutes to respond, followed by 5 minutes of dialogue for a total of 15 minutes for each question. After the 3 questions, each speaker will give a 5-minute closing statement. We will then have 30 minutes of Q&A from the audience, and after the formal Q&A, the speakers will be staying at the front to continue to answer any questions, and then around 9, we'll be heading over to Prenup Pub on College Street to continue the discussion. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Cameron, and we can get started.
All right, hello. So tonight, I will be your moderators tonight, and I just basically want to say that we're here to talk about morality. Suffice to say, the organizers have done a good job in picking somebody who has their own personal opinions, but is going to relinquish them in the face of their moderating duties. Basically, what I want to set here today is the tone of the debate. We are living in a time of great polarization. We have Facebook conversations, we have fake news sites, we have a ton of polarity out there, and we always tend to focus on compelling narratives, things that sound good to us internally. We tend not to listen to stories from our head as opposed to our hearts. What I want to do tonight is to say we're at the university and we are scholars, all of us here. And as scholars, how do we respond to this sort of cultural minutia, this cultural degrading of the conversation? And what I'd like today is to submit to our speakers tonight is to do a better job explaining the foundational and intellectual aspects of their positions, to cite their sources, to swap stories for arguments, and to speak not from the heart but from the head. Above all, I hope the speakers tonight will engage with each other and clearly articulate their objections. These two camps are not predisposed to talk to each other. We engage with each other with different languages, with different tones and different hearts. We have different motivations and different objectives. So our arguments often tend to fall on deaf ears. So tonight, let's attempt to elevate the discussion a little bit and delve deep into our differences. And with that, I'd like to pose the first question to our two speakers. We're going to start with Mike. So the first question is belief in God necessary to live a moral life?
Thank you, Cameron. And I'd like to divide this question into two parts, which can be seen as, first of all, can you have a non-religious morality to begin with, a subjective morality as such that you can use to lead a meaningful life? And then can we somehow take this subjective moralities, because everybody would have their own as such, and then use them to create a society in which everyone will be happy? So for the first part of the question, I want to show that you don't need a God to have a morality, and it definitely doesn't have to be objective. So one thing to keep in mind is for 80,000 years, humans have been developing as Homo sapiens without some need for that objective morality, without the Christian morality, because we can approximate the time of Homo sapiens as such that we can actually think, we can reason, as for the last 80,000 years at the minimum, if not more. So then I want to propose this question, which Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris has also touched upon, which is, first of all, how were we surviving for all those 80,000 years without that objective morality? And were all those people going to hell? Or maybe they were living good, secular, and if not secular, then at least subjectively moral lives by their beliefs. Second, I want to show a few scientific arguments for subjective morality. The first being by a Russian evolutionary psychologist by the name of Markov. And so what he proposes that, and this argument has been put forward by many scientists actually, is that morality precedes religion as such for two reasons. First of all, it exists in animals. So for example, monkeys would share food with other primates that have groomed them in the past. And for example, ants will sacrifice themselves for the good of the colony. Now, I don't think we can say that either monkeys or ants are religious. And that's why I do think they can have subjective morality that's successful there for their needs, and so can we. Also, humans before Christianity have lived very moral lives, in my opinion. And I want to ask if for some reason that is not good enough for us, and are those people going to hell? And just to point out that morality, by what we can see as sharing, altruism, has been around before caveman paintings of religious statues in, for example, France. So how can that be if morality can only come from religion? Last point would be that we should have a sustainable morality. So we always talk about sustainable energy, how we should take away coal, how we should take away nuclear energy, how we should try to be sustainable for the future, how to avoid global warming, etc. But how about sustainable morality as an idea? Because in the times of Trump that we're living in right now, I would think that it's a scarier concept of what will happen if we don't have the sustainable morality than if we don't have sustainable energy. And that's where I want to stop.
Okay, great, thank you very much. All right, Peter, would you like to respond?
Sure. All right, well, thank you for coming tonight. Thank you, Mike, for talking. I heard you're a smart guy, so I'm looking for a good evening tonight. The question is belief in God necessary to live a moral life? And I would say clearly it's not. There's many atheists, people who don't believe in God, who live a moral life. And by that I mean moral and kind to other people. I've had personally the opportunity and pleasure to have many atheist friends who've been very kind and nice. I think of my friend Jake McLennan, someone I've never actually met in real life, but we've interacted many times on the internet. And although we strongly disagree, he's always been very respectful and civil towards me, and I appreciate that. I think of my friend Sam Wigington. He's from Australia, grew up in going to a Christian school, but became an atheist. When I was living in Korea, I wanted to go to Seoul to check out Gangnam because of the song Gangnam Style. And he was living there, kind enough to show me around. And I was starting up a new Facebook page at the time called Mars Summit, which I still run now. It was basically to promote Christianity. He was an atheist. He knew it was there to promote Christianity. And yet he still gave me a bunch of good tips about how to promote it and do it and things like that. I was impressed. The guy was a nice guy. I think also my friend Chaz Warren. He was from the US, grew up in a Pentecostal home, became an atheist as a teenager. When I came to town, he let me stay at his place in his spare room, invited me to share a meal with the family. And then when I was going into Christian ministry, I asked him for an endorsement for people who might want to support my ministry. He was kind enough to give me an endorsement. How many atheists would give an endorsement for a Christian to go into Christian ministry? These are the experiences I've had with atheists. I know for a fact that they can be kind, nice people. And I count it as a privilege to be their friend. I also know that it's not just these friends. Atheists throughout the world are able to be kind and nice to many people. There's an organization called Foundation Beyond Belief. They have a great website. It's to help people who are atheists or secular in the outlook be able to find nonprofits that align with their worldview and be able to give money to help people. They also help atheists and secular people to be able to volunteer in these organizations. I am sometimes discouraged by the way I see Christians being nasty towards atheists. If you're a Christian, you've never had the opportunity to get to know an atheist well, you've missed out. There's a lot of nice atheists out there. And sometimes I hear atheists or Christians say, yeah, but you see, they're so nasty online when I talk to them and stuff. Well, okay, yeah, there's good and bad people in every group. But keep in mind also, if you just made snide remarks about how they're going to go to hell and how they're dumb and how they're wrong, I mean, you kind of shouldn't be so surprised if they're kind of a little bit upset in return, right? But if you give atheists a chance and get to know them just on a human level, you realize they're great people. They do a lot of great things. They can have a lot of great interests in life, live a meaningful and full life, and just be kind and good people. If you're a Christian who's been bad to an atheist simply because they're an atheist, and especially if you call yourself a Christian, shame on you. You shouldn't be doing that. You call yourself a Christian, a follower of Jesus, and Jesus said to love your neighbor. Your atheist friend is your neighbor. He deserves to be loved. She deserves to be loved and respected as well. I'd like to finish off with a little story here. I don't know if it's a true story or not. It's supposed to be from Judeo-Christian literature, and it's titled, Why Did God Create Atheists? Like I said, I don't know if it's true or not, but I think it has a good message to it. And I think that's what matters. So this is from like Orthodox Jewish literature, not my religious tradition. But I think there's still a good point to it that I think atheists and religious people, Christians, Jews can appreciate. It goes like this. Why did God create atheists? There's a famous story told in Judeo-Christian literature that addresses this very question. The master teaches the student that God created everything in the world to be appreciated, since everything is here to teach us a lesson. One clever student asks, what lesson can we learn from atheists? Why did God create them? The master responds, God created atheists to teach us the most important lesson of them all, the lesson of true compassion. You see, when an atheist performs an act of charity, visits someone who is sick, helps someone in need, and cares for the world, he's not doing so because of some religious teaching. He does not believe that God commanded him to perform this act. In fact, he does not believe in God at all. So his acts are based on an inner sense of morality. And look at the kindness he can bestow upon others simply because he feels it to be right. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we're going to have 5 minutes for a back and forth dialogue. And we've seen already two kind of different approaches. So I do want to talk to you a little bit about that, Peter. So where does works versus faith fit into you? Just so we can kind of get a better sense of your position. And then Mike can come in and talk about his sustainable morality.
So that's in Christian theology, works and faith are like technical terms. Do you mean that in the sense of Christian theology?
Yes.
Okay, well, the Christian conviction is that that God expects us to be perfect. That is God's standard because that's what he deserves. He's an all-powerful, perfect God. And so all of us have failed to be perfect. Unless you are perfect, you are under God's judgment and his wrath. So you can never be right before God by doing enough good things to make up for your failure to be perfect. So the Christian conviction, the Christian message, the gospel, is that we are in need of God's grace and his mercy to be made right with him. We cannot do good things, but if we put our faith in God to forgive us because of our sins, because of the things that we have done wrong, then we can be made right before God. And then as a result, good works, good things, our actions, our lives are changed. God changes our heart, our thoughts, our heart changes, and then our lives change as a result. So we can't do enough good things because we've already failed to be perfect. But that doesn't mean that works are unimportant. We're not saved by them, but they're a result of our salvation.
Mike, do you want to respond?
I appreciate the way you view atheists and think that we can have a great morality.
Good, I thought we'd agree on this one.
I thought so too. And it's great that you think so. One thing I would try to oppose is this notion that humans are somehow by nature sinners, by nature imperfect. Now, I'm not saying you can be a perfect human being. I really don't think so. But when we are born, a human baby can be considered a blank slate, in my opinion, and it shouldn't be judged as right away a mistake and something that is impure, imperfect, and it should be made to show its act in, or it shows morality in its actions, rather than a story about it or its ancestors.
So I'll respond to that?
Yeah, keep going back and forth, guys.
So,
Yep.
I mean, the Christian message is not that human beings or children born are mistakes. We're created in God's image. So we're deeply loved by God, and there's no mistakes that are created. I want to object to that word. But I think what you're referring to is the doctrine of original sin, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah.
And there's two aspects of that. There's the idea that we receive guilt from our ancestors going back all the way to Adam, or that we also receive our guilty, sinful nature or desire to do things that are wrong, right? I haven't reflected on this fully. I tend not to agree with the idea that we inherit guilt, so that we're not born guilty, but we do inherit a sinful nature. And I think we can see that in life. I mean, you can see that in children. You know, we're not all as bad as we can be, I think, because of the grace of God. But we do have desires to do things that are wrong. And I think that comes out because, I mean, you know, if we go around this room, we say, would you like to be a good person and not do anything wrong for the rest of your life? Most people would say yes. But even if we all decide tonight we're never going to do anything wrong again for the rest of our lives, we're all going to end up doing things that are wrong. Why does that happen? I think it's because we have this sinful nature, this desire to do things that are wrong in us.
One thing I would ask about that would be that if there is a subjective morality, right, and we say that we do things that are wrong. Now, that wrongness comes out of societal norms, societal expectations of us not to murder, not to kill, and not to rape, and because of that, we consider ourselves sinners, although we have innate urges to do them. But just the fact that they are societal norms and not some objective idea, because I don't believe in objective morality, makes me want to question, like, why is it so wrong then to do those things, right? Because, for example, if you go back in history, murder against other clans, against other tribes was not immoral. It's actually very evolutionary adaptational.
Yeah, so I don't see morality as just being, the terms objective and subjective can be used in different ways. The American philosopher John Searle has pointed out you can use the word objective in an ontological sense or an epistemological sense. So that means ontological is about what exists. So if it's ontologically objective, that means it exists because, or it's true because of a reality outside of your mind. And ontologically subjective is true because of what you think in your mind. Now, epistemologically objective and epistemologically subjective is a different thing, right? This is about determining what is true, right? And if you're objective, you're trying to remove personal biases. And if you're epistemologically subjective, you are allowing your personal biases and preferences to come in. So when you say objective, subjective, which one are you referring to?
Referring more to the, the idea that there's something inherently wrong. So I'm not sure if it's ontological or epistemological, as you mentioned, but this idea that some act of evil is not meant to be that way. Well, then the question would be, what is it meant to be? Then what is that perfect action, or why is that action wrong? So that's what I'm referring to.
Okay, so I think we might have some confusion if we're not clarifying ontological and epistemological objective, but we can pass that for now. I think maybe you know, like it's something you need to, sometimes you need to think about it a little bit. I know when I first heard it, it required some thought. But what I would wonder, I mean, this kind of gets into the second question here. Do we have much time left?
We're pretty much, we're done over 5 minutes. So
okay,
would
so
you
why
guys
don't we
just like
stop
to
with the
quickly
second
clarify what you guys mean by objective, basically? Because I think I get where you're coming from on this sort of angle and stuff, but Mike, do you believe in objective morals? Are they something that does exist?
No.
No.
All morals are subjective.
All morals are subjective. Okay, so I think that sets us up well to go into the next question then. So, the next question. 1 second. So, since we now have a pretty clear vision of we have objective and subjective, are there moral statements that hold true no matter what anyone thinks? And what are some examples? And let's try to get some clear-cut examples. Let's also try to get some sort of examples on the gray zone, if you guys can, just to kind of really kind of position yourselves well. So, Mike, you get to go first again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so by the virtue of my position and that there is no such thing as objective morality, I would have to say that no, there is no such thing, no such act that is always bad. Categorical imperatives, as Kant would put it, I believe. And so if you could say that it's never moral to kill, then I would have an objection for you, which would be, would you kill a person who's about to kill 2 people, right? Thou shalt not kill, but where does that apply? And where is there a line where we can say, oh, 2 people, but we're not sure if he's gonna do it? It's really the question of, would you kill baby Hitler, right? Can there be a point where you're sure enough that a person will harm someone that the act of killing him is somehow virtuous, right? So I would say that no, there is no such time that we can say that this is wrong for sure or this is right for sure. And society, by negotiation of its norms and expectations, has to clarify with its members what it expects from them, right? This idea of a sustainable morality, well, if you just say that everyone can kill because, you know, of vigilante justice, well, then we'll have a chaotic society, and I don't believe that's good. Now, if we can agree on sustainable morals, that we can legislate, because I want to see how my or subjective morality can be legislated, right, into a peaceful society, then I think that we would achieve that society, right? Example number 2, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, so nothing is inherently evil about adultery. It's a biological urge. It's something that, in a way, we are all, like all males are supposed to do because we want to have as many offspring as possible, right? Now, does that mean I'm a sinner and I'm going to hell? I don't think so if I was going to commit adultery, because it's a societal norm that had to be created for the insurance that females would have, that males would take care of the children. So we can see that from societal needs, in order to have a peaceful society where kids are brought up healthy and with both parents, that's where we achieve such 10 commandments as such, and especially thou shalt not commit adultery. For my last point, let's take, for example, development of nuclear or biological weapons, as we've seen now in Syria, and nuclear weapons, of course, we've seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, some of you may not know this, but for example, when Eisenhower decided upon this campaign of nuclear bombing of Japan, the original decision was to bomb Tokyo, and that was considered, or I should say Kyoto, pardon me, is considered immoral because it was a religious center for the Japanese, and so they went on to small cities which had populations of roughly 100 to 200,000 people. Now, in that decision, he had to calculate many factors, and we could say, oh, that is never right to nuke any city of any religion of any enemy. But then we actually consider the numbers that go into that kind of decision, which is that if we were to go and invade, for example, Japan by foot, it would cost about 1 million lives in both American and Japanese lives. If we were to nuke them, as mean as that sounds, it would be the most peaceful solution at the time. So the same can be applied to biological weapons. Now, I don't know what kind of rationale they would put forward. Maybe they would say that it would scare people out of fighting and therefore save lives in the process. But at the same time, we once again cannot say that that's objectively wrong, because there is no societal norm that we can judge them by except for our own. So they will have their societal norms, and a dictator will have his norms. Now, if that's sustainable, we should go along with that. Now, I don't think that's sustainable, and that's why I think that Syria right now is in big trouble. But that will be its own judge, and there doesn't need to be any heaven or hell for those actions.
Okay. All right, Peter, would you like to respond?
Sure. There was a little miscommunication, I think. The papers I had to hand out, but they were supposed to be handed out during my time, so that if there was any distraction, it was while I was speaking. So I just want to apologize. There must have been some miscommunication there. Thank you for handing them out, whoever did, but just because that's what we had talked about earlier, and it didn't happen the way we planned. So thank you for sharing, Mike. I think there are moral statements that hold true no matter what anyone thinks, and I'd like to give some examples of those. Number one, it's wrong to hate someone simply because of their sexual orientation. It's wrong to systematically exterminate 6 million Jews, as the Nazis did. It's wrong to be rude to your parents without any good reason. It's wrong to torture babies just for fun. Here are 4 things that I think are right and good, no matter what anyone thinks. It's right and good to be kind to atheists. It's right and good to practice compassion. It's right and good to help strangers who are in need, everything else being equal. It's right and good to treat all people equally, regardless of their race or ethnicity. Now, I appreciated Mike's candor in saying that there's nothing inherently, I don't remember exactly the words he said, but you espouse subjective morality. I'd like to say, I believe that there's objective morality, and by that I mean the truth of moral statements is not dependent upon what people think. Because if we make moral statements true because of what people think, then it really reduces down to a matter of opinion. It's a matter of, do you like ice cream? Do you like, say, chocolate ice cream versus vanilla ice cream? If somebody likes chocolate and the other person likes vanilla, there's really no place to say you should like chocolate. There's just different ideas about what the best flavor is. That's not the way we treat morality. We don't act that way in everyday life. We might say that in particular circumstances or in a debate or discussion, but once we leave here and live our lives, we will expect people to behave a particular way, and we won't just say, well, it's my opinion, if you like to live this way, right? That's the way we live our lives, and I think that shows what we really believe is true. Even if you disagree with these statements, you're still going to live your life in a particular way where you expect people to do certain things, and you think they should do it even if they disagree. When terrorists blow up a bomb in a city, we don't just say, well, they had a different idea about it. We think it's wrong, they think it's right, we just don't like it. No, we think they should not do it even if they disagree with us. And I think there's many other examples of that. We say the Nazis should not have killed 6 million Jews, even if they thought it was right. We think they were wrong. They should not have done that. What makes sense of this should, that we all seem to live our lives? Even I hear atheists over and over making moral condemnations of Christians, of Islamic terrorists, people like Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins. They do this over and over again. And I think that shows that we don't think morality is just a matter of opinion. It's not just based in our minds. But if it's not just based in our minds, then what makes it true? Well, there must be something that exists outside of our minds that makes it true. Well, what exists outside of our minds? We can point to the physical world, but the problem there is that the physical world has no moral implications. I can't point to a chair in front of me and say, because that chair exists, terrorists should not blow up bombs. I can't point to the sun, or maybe today it was clouds. Can't point to those clouds and say you should be compassionate, or you should not torture babies for fun, or you should be kind to strangers because those clouds exist. Physical things don't have moral implications. So that only leaves us with a third option. if we are going to acknowledge the way we live our lives, and we acknowledge that we don't base our morality just in our thoughts and our minds and our opinions, and we realize the physical world doesn't ground that, doesn't make it true, then there must be some non-physical reality that makes moral statements objectively true, ontologically objective. But this non-physical reality, that is what we can call God. Now, this God isn't necessarily the Christian God. Just based upon this argument, you can't conclude who or what this God is. I believe it is the Christian God. But for the purpose of this argument, all we can say is there's some non-physical reality. I think that's a challenge for anyone who denies the existence of God. We live our lives as if objective morality exists. We sense that to be true. But if we don't affirm this non-physical reality, how do we make sense of that? There's a number of objections that can be given to this argument. I'll list a few of them, and you've got those on your paper there. If I don't finish them all, well, you can read them off the paper, and if you would like to discuss them or in the Q&A you'd like to bring them up, I'd love to address them. One of them is to say, well, evolution explains morality, not God. Number 2, objective morality only requires recognizing the right goal, the flourishing of all conscious creatures. Another one, morality is simply relative to a particular culture or society. And I think I've run out of time, so if you want to look at the rest of them, you can just look at them yourself, and you're welcome to ask me about them or some other objection if you think of one. Thank you.
All right, so we have a couple of differences here. We've talked a little bit about moral absolutism. We've talked a little bit about utilitarianism and the ontology. So I don't know where that leaves us in kind of much of a middle ground. So does either of you have a strong desire to go first?
Sure. Can I just ask you a question?
Sure,
and then
please.
we
Yeah.
Go back.
Yeah,
forth? So
definitely.
I think I understand. I think you're a lot of times talking about epistemology in terms of deciding what is right and wrong. But would you really say that, say, killing 6 million Jews, is that when I say that's wrong, is that just my opinion, or do you think there's something more than opinion there?
It's a good question, actually, and it's hard. It must be hard for any religious person to get such an idea that act like genocide of 6 million Jews, for example, cannot be inherently evil. Now, I'd like to make a distinction here. There is evil acts inside a society, and there is intra-societal evil acts that you would call a genocide, or maybe you would call warfare, right? So let's take for example that you brought up, which is the killing of 6 million Jews. Now, we can't say, however much we want to, we can't say that there is something inherently wrong in it as a subjective moral, as a moral relativist. I wouldn't be able to say that. And I would go on to say that we can take self-defense by our social norms, and a social norm should be self-defense, in my opinion.
They should be what? The social norms should be...
We should take. So if somebody was attacking me and was trying to commit genocide against my people, I would be able to use self-defense against them, because that's a societal norm that my society has. Now,
okay, but should people follow, like when you say people should follow their societal norms, is that just your opinion, or is that more than opinion?
I think that the societal norms should be made by the people, so therefore, yes, people should follow their own societal norms.
Okay, but why should everybody follow their society norms? If that's just your opinion, and somebody disagrees with your opinion, then there's nothing beyond their opinion to say that, right? If you're saying that everybody within Canadian society should follow their societal norms, then and it's not just a matter of opinion, then don't you need something outside of your mind to base that in?
Mm-hmm. And that's a good question. I mean, if it's just a matter of taste, if it's a matter of apples versus oranges, then where does that leave us? Well, that's where sustainable morality comes in, and for personal use, when you're deciding on what's there to do, is there really something wrong for me to do? And so if my action will lead to either the harm of the human race as a whole, or my family, or me for that matter, if I'm going to go to jail, then of course I shouldn't do that. And of course, then it's not sustainable.
Okay, but so now I feel a lot of times when atheists respond to this, they'll say no, morality is subjective, but then they smuggle in an objective morality in the back door. And I feel like when you talk about sustainable morality, what you're trying to do is actually say, no, there are norms that everybody should follow, and they're not just a matter of opinion. And I applaud you for saying that, because I think that's what we all sense to be true, right? But then how do you make sense of that, though, if you say there's no kind of God or non-physical reality that exists that implies that or makes that true?
Okay, so I'd like to make the distinction between objective morality, which is something that was there a priori before humans, right? And something that is objectively sustainable, which means that it will lead to a better society. We always say, be the change you want to see in this world. Well, that's where I'm coming from, is that if I can act morally in such a way that my society will go on, then that's objectively something that will lead to a better world. Now, there doesn't have to be any religious connotation here, right?
Okay, so but what happens if, now I think this is another way of responding. This is actually, I think, number 2 on my list there, right? In order to have objective morality, we just need a goal, what makes the world a better place, seems to be the goal you're saying, right? But what if someone, if someone shares that goal, I think you can then say, you have this goal, you should act in this way to reach this goal.
Mm-hmm.
But what if they don't have that goal, right? What if they say, I'm a psychopath and the goal of my morality is not to make the world a better place, it's just to make me happy? On what basis can you say should? Because it's kind of like, if you want to drive to Ottawa, I want to drive to Vancouver, we have different goals. If you tell me I should drive east, I'll say, why? I want to go to Vancouver, right? So if a psychopath wants to ensure the flourishing of himself, you want to ensure the flourishing of the world, then what basis do you have to say that he should do
Thanks for bringing that up, and it's a good question. So I would make, once again, the distinction between intra-societal morality and society that goes between moralities. So the in and out. So if it's in a society, and I'm living in Canada and I see a Canadian psychopath, right, which is hard to imagine, but if there was, right, then I would say that the laws that we create as a society, together, that we negotiate, because laws are a negotiation of human beings, right? That they would demand him to do something or not to do something based on if we consider that sustainable or not. Now, I can't tell him what he should or should not do, but the society and the laws that we've created as a society can.
Okay, and do we still have more time?
Well, this is actually pretty good. So I actually did want to kind of keep this going, actually, but one thing I kind of want to ask then, like we've just talked about, obviously large sort of moral things, but what about as Mike said, which is, killing one person to save two? If you are a moral absolutist and killing is always wrong, what happens in that case?
Good, well thank you. I think that's good to clarify here. When I say morality is objective, I'm saying it's not based just human opinion. It's based on something outside of that. Now, there's a difference between philosophy ontology and epistemology, right? So ontology is about what exists, and that's what I'm talking about. What exists that makes moral statements true, right? Determining what the right morality is, which is what you brought up, that's an epistemological question. So that's a different type of question. If morality just comes down to whatever we think in our minds, then it's easy to determine what is right and wrong. I just think in my mind what I like, and that's it, right? But if morality exists outside of my mind, then there are right and wrong answers, right? And we need to try to determine what are those right and wrong answers. I think it's a little bit like, now I want to also point out, determining the right and wrong answers is a separate question, though, from what makes moral statements true. It's a little bit like the stars in the sky. So let me give you an analogy here, right? Suppose someone says, well, are they just something in your mind, or do they exist as reality outside of your mind, right? And I would argue, say, no, those stars are not just in my imagination. They exist in reality out there. And I argue for that. See, stars exist objectively. They're ontologically objective. And then someone says, okay, well, how many stars are there? What are they made out of? What are they like? I'd say, okay, well, that's an epistemological question. And if the stars exist outside of my mind, then there is a right and wrong answer to that. And I can be wrong about it. But if the stars are just something that I create in my mind, then the number of stars that exist are whatever I imagine in my mind, right? So this question itself, I think, presupposes that morality exists as something, its truth is based on something outside of my mind. And it can be tricky to know what the right answer is in certain situations. But I would argue, say for specifically that one, that morality is not absolute in the sense that sometimes an overriding factor can be more important, right? So it's better to kill one person rather than many people, right? Mm-hmm. So that I wouldn't say that morality is absolute in that sense that I think both of you were coming at, right? I think one moral issue or one good can supersede another.
Okay, so you took 2 minutes there, so I'll give Mike 2 minutes to respond
Sure.
to if he wants
Go
it.
ahead.
Sure. One thing to bring up would be the difference between empirical evidence of stars existing, of the telescopes that tell us as such, the senses that tell us such, and the difference between that and morality, which we cannot see, which we cannot objectify, which we cannot prove. Right, from a long time ago, we can't say, "Oh, I've seen morality; it's over there on the West Coast." No, we can't say that. And so, I would say that just by the statement that we cannot see morality, the onus would be on the objective moralist to prove that it's somehow there. Now, another point I would like to bring up is the point of vicarious redemption that Christians have, right? And I'd like to clarify this with you, right? That if somebody can take my sins and excuse me for them, and also that Jesus died for us is the commonly said phrase, then doesn't that erase the whole point of morality? That now I have no responsibility. I can do whatever I want, commit murder, and right up to, well, for example, abortion, which a week ago or so, the Pope allowed all Roman Catholic priests to pardon and to forgive for the people who do abortion. Now, doesn't that take away the moral responsibility that I think every atheist should have and every person should have? And if it's not there, then we're losing out on something. So that's where I want to leave with that.
Okay. All right, do you guys want to move on to the last question then?
Sure, sounds good.
Okay. All right, so the last question here. Canadian society, including our universities and schools, were influenced by Judeo-Christian morality. What place, if any, should this morality have in contemporary society? And Mike, you go first again.
Thanks. So now we can talk about how we incorporate the sustainable society in a secular world. And there's no question about the division between the state and the church. I think that's been established. And the difference between US and Canada is that in the US it's in the Constitution, in Canada it's actually not. But we can see from times in Canada's past where we've had the church in control of public institutions. For example, the Great Darkness in Quebec from 1945 to 1959, in which the Premier of Quebec had given a lot of power for the Roman Catholic Church to take over education. And those were some of the worst years in Quebec's history when progressives were complaining, everything else in North America is going forward, but we're staying back. And I think that's a common theme in religion as a whole. Now, apart from that, it depends on the moral that we want to put forward into our schools and into our universities. So, for example, if you're talking about the golden rule, then go ahead. And I will make an exception for that rule because I think it's required and it's necessary for sustainable growth. And I think that's one of the things that religion and Christianity has got totally right, and I totally agree with. And I'd like to see that in our schools being taught to our children so we don't have the type of Trump mentality, right? But at the same time, there are a lot of values that I don't want to put forward into our schools that we see in the Bible. For example, Leviticus, right, of all the slavery chapter verses, right? Of the slave should fear his master like he would fear his God. Now, do I want to see that type of slavery mentality in my kids that I will see growing up in Canadian schools? Do I want to see aestheticism, which is the value and the virtue of not taking anything for yourself, of this type of altruism where you don't want money, you'd like to be poor, like Mother Teresa said, the poor, the blessed are the poor, right? Now, I don't want to see that in Canadian society or Canadian schools, for that matter. I'd rather see morality being propagated, if propagated, because that's a big if you want to do that in schools, of morality of sustainable growth, morality that we can all agree on as a society. And if we can't agree on anything as a society, then morality should be kept out of institutions altogether.
All right. I didn't actually use my 2 minute sign there. Okay, great. So, Peter?
All right. Okay, so the question is, Canadian society, including our universities and schools, were influenced by Judeo-Christian morality. What place, if any, should this morality have in contemporary society? So I want to answer this question a little more broadly than you did, not just about universities and schools, but about Canadian society in general, right? I understand universities are part of society, so it's appropriate to say that, but I'm just going to be a little broader. There's two ways that I'd like to see this continue. One of them is in concern for the poor and the weak, and all human beings having equal value. Tom Holland is a British historian, and he says at a very young age he went to Sunday school class, and when he learned in Sunday school class that humans and dinosaurs were alive at the right time, he's like, this ain't right. Like a 6-year-old, he's like, no, this is bogus. And as he grew up, his objections to Christianity just compounded. And by the time he was an adult, he basically had no desire for religion. I don't think he would describe himself as an atheist, but he was certainly non-religious. He became a historian, studied the ancient world. And in his study of the ancient world, he was, at one point in time, a little bit rather shocked because he realized they had a very different morality than contemporary British or Western society. And specifically, he studied ancient Greece and ancient Rome, more of a Western European world. I know Rome was more than that, but that was a part of it, right? And what he realized is their morality is very different from his, especially in their concern for the weak and the poor. Here's what he said: the longer I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, the more alien and unsettling I came to find it. It was not just the extremes of callousness that I came to find shocking, but the lack of a sense that the poor or the weak might have any intrinsic value. He goes on to say, today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in post-Christian societies will take for granted that it is nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I am not a Greek or a Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. Christianity is not the only religion that shows care and compassion for the poor. Buddhists talk a lot about compassion. So I'm not claiming that Christianity is the only religion that does this. But Christianity certainly has influenced Western society, including Canadian society, to have this desire and concern. I like to see this continue. I don't believe we should be forced to do this in any particular way, but I would like to see Canadians voluntarily continue to be concerned for this type of thing. The other thing I'd like to see continue is the opportunity to have free religion and free expression for people to, including atheists, to be able to express their ideas, people of all religions to be able to express their ideas, and certainly I think Christians should be free to express and share their Christian message, which is also called the gospel. I do this, and I really believe this, because I believe Christianity is objectively true. I believe it is more rational and makes more sense than any other religion or worldview out there. And so I think the Christian message is very important. The Christian message essentially is that there's a God that exists who loves us dearly, but created us to worship him, to love him, to express our love through this worship, and to love each other. The problem is all of us have failed to do that. We fail to love each other. We fail to love him as he deserves. And because God is also perfectly just, we are under his wrath and punishment. But because of his great love for us, he's made it possible for us to be forgiven, possible for us to be made right with him again. And this is possible because the sins that we deserve, the punishment that we deserved, was placed upon Jesus in his death. And that because of his death and resurrection, we can be made right with God. If you are here today and you have never said yes to God, and you have never said, I want to be made right with him, I invite you to at least consider this. I would love for you to more and accept it, but I would love for you, say if you're an atheist or non-religious person, to at least consider this. And I'd like to see that continue in Canadian society because I've seen it transform lives. When people say yes to God, and they say, I want to follow God, not follow my own life and do things the way I would like to do them, their lives are transformed. Teenagers who are drug addicts are released from their addictions to drugs. That's a Christian ministry called Teen Challenge has been part of this. Marriages are transformed. Husbands and wives who don't love each other, their lives are changed. People who maybe don't care about the poor, other people, suddenly they give their lives for that. They go overseas to care for people who are suffering. They want to end slavery like William Wilberforce. This has happened throughout history and in Canadian society today. And I like to see this kind of morality continue and to influence people, not because they're forced to, but because they freely choose to. Thank you.
Okay. All right, very interesting. So I think the big disagreement between you two might be just how does this work and when it comes at the state level? What does the state do? And I want to throw something at you guys and see if you both agree. If I said the statement of a secular society is best for the non-religious and the religious alike, do you guys agree or disagree with that? Who wants to go first?
Do you want to go first?
Please.
Okay, well, now it depends. What do you mean by a secular society? In some I believe in a certain degree of separation of church and state, but I don't think that's a black and white issue. I know it's not part of the Canadian Constitution, and in fact, our nation wasn't. We have a Catholic school system that gets government money. Because it was not set up to be a secular school system. It was set up to be a Catholic school system and a Protestant school system. So that's not the way Canadian society was started, but it has changed and evolved so that it has become much more secular. Now, we could kind of debate and discuss, is this good or is this bad? But I'd like to say that I think it is important that when people, decide to become Christians, they do this of their own free choice, not because they're compelled or because their life will become easier. I think one of the things that ruined Christianity in the early Roman Empire is when it became really part of the state religion, or you could advance in the Roman Empire by becoming a religion or by joining the Christian church. Because then you had people joining not because they loved God and because this is what they wanted to believe and live for, but because it advanced and helped their careers or something like that. So I don't want to see Canadian society develop a situation where people become Christians in order to help their careers or some other type of advantage. But I think also when you say secular society, is that good or bad? Well, there's lots of different kinds of secular society, right? I mean, you have atheistic, communist type secular societies where religious people experience brutal persecution. I mean, that continues today in a place like North Korea, where Christian people are thrown into prisons. And I think at least part of this has to come because of the atheist convictions of those leaders. Now, I'm not claiming all atheists are like that. Remember I said earlier, there's lots of nice atheists, right? So, and you can have religious people leading a society who can also do bad things as well. But, it kind of depends what we mean by secular society.
Yep, Mike, I think he gave you a good segue there.
Great, and I'd also like to point out that there are societies like Saudi Arabia which do horrible things to atheists, and even for online bloggers who would like to share their thoughts. Well, if you lose the right of freedom of speech, freedom of religious expression, or lack thereof, then we are in trouble as a society. So I agree that both atheist and religious society should be more tolerable. Now, on the topic of separation of church and state, it comes from a vital need in the age of immigration to accommodate all religions and all religious denominations. So if you have Muslims and Christians and agnostics and atheists and Buddhists and Taoists, then how do you reconcile such views? Well, to be honest, the only solution that the government would come up with is to be completely neutral in its secularity and to completely separate the state from the church. So I would say it needs to be a complete separation. Now, does that mean we can't teach some religious morality in religious schools? Well, I would say that maybe in Sunday schools you can, but in any institution where you are teaching science, math, and the empirical studies, there shouldn't be any mention of either religious worldview or religious morality.
How are we for time? Should I respond?
We can maybe do like 30 minutes, 30
30
seconds.
minutes, great.
30 seconds each, just so we can maybe keep a bit of time.
Okay.
Sounds like you guys are pretty much in agreement.
Yeah,
so.
I think, there is a value in worth. I want to see my atheist friends be able to be non-religious and atheists without any kind of coercion or persecution as a result of that. So in many ways it can, but I think also when you say the state is completely neutral, I also don't think I think it's quite difficult. Theoretically, yeah, that's nice, but in reality, I think morality and laws are embedded within worldviews, and it's really hard to escape that. Martin Luther King Jr., in his March for Civil Rights, argued that all people were equal because they were created in God's image. And he was very motivated by his Christian convictions. and I think we oftentimes don't realize that a lot of the morality we have, or the laws that we enact, are shaped and formed by our Christian heritage, such as a concern for the poor and the weak, right? So I think we both share that we'd like to see laws concerned for them, but so when we think we're being neutral, I don't think we often are, and I think religion and worldview will impact our laws one way or another.
Okay, Mike?
I agree with you that there is some bias that officials have when enacting certain laws, maybe perhaps when writing them, but I completely disagree on the topic of laws being legislated because of religious beliefs and the reasons behind the laws being because of religious beliefs. For example, let's take the example of the poor. Well, if you look in Canadian society, the social welfare state actually emerged after the Great Depression, and in the times of bad economy, when it became clear that the classical capitalist system of laissez-faire, of free trade, no tariffs on anyone, proved to be failing when there was no concern from the state to the people, where everybody was unhappy, right? And those social welfare reforms came from that era. They weren't around before, because before, the only people in charge of charity programs in Canada were actually religious institutions as such. Now, you can say, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it seems that the state has realized the secular needs to help the poor to advance the society for a sustainable society.
Okay. All right, so now we've concluded our three question part, and I know it's a little bit premature, but can we get our speakers a little bit of a round of applause, please? Okay. All right, so now we're going to move into the question section, and I'm going to ask everybody to basically stand up, raise their hand if they have a question, and I will try to get to as many people as we can. Because we are on video and there is a limited audio capability, for respect of the people who might be watching this on YouTube, please keep your questions as succinct as possible. No speeches, a question as succinct as possible, if we could, please. So
You're going to repeat the question,
I will
right?
repeat the question. I'll try to summarize it if possible, too. So if anybody who has a question, please raise their hand now.
And please say who it's directed towards,
Yes.
right?
Please say who it's directed towards, if it's to both or to one party. And, sorry, I'm going to go with you, actually. Yeah. Stand up, please yell it as loud as you can, just in case the video can capture it, and then I'll repeat it.
Okay, so my question was directed at you. So earlier you mentioned how we all feel that killing babies or the Holocaust, that we all feel this is bad, and this is certainly true. But what argument do you have that, without resorting to our personal feelings about what is right and wrong, that morality is objective, and where does this objective morality come from?
Okay. So if I can just summarize then, is just where is the basis or grounding of objective morality, whether at God or something else? Is that a fair assessment?
And what is an argument that objective morality exists
And-
without referring to our personal feelings?
Great.
What's right and wrong?
So what arguments for objective morality exist without resorting to personal feelings? And was that directed at you, Peter?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah, so ultimately I think we know that certain things are right and wrong because we sense that they are. I don't think it's not an empirical sense, but I think we sense that they are, similar to the way I know this table exists. Do I have an argument to prove this table exists? No, but I see it. Unless I have any reason to think I'm hallucinating or dreaming, I'm perfectly justified in believing this table really is here. I think we have ways of sensing and knowing things are true beyond our empirical faculties, beyond just simply hearing or smelling, tasting. I think we sense that it's wrong to kill 6 million Jews just because they're Jews. Now, I know you might object to this sense. It might sound like a sixth sense or something like that. And you're like, this is mysterious. But the reality is, I think that's what we all conclude, whether you're an atheist or a Buddhist or Hindu or Christian. You sense that you live your life saying that's wrong, and it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. So if you have that conviction, I think as we all do, well then it can be a question for all of us. Well, how do you know that's true? And I think that's a challenge for the atheist to explain it if you don't want to have this other kind of sixth sense. I know that sounds spooky. Maybe I shouldn't use that word, but this kind of sense that we have it.
Mike, did you want to respond?
Yeah, just 2 quick points. The first would be that I understand where you're coming from when you kind of feel that it must be wrong. But there is a difference between the senses, the 5 senses, right, that tells us there is a table here. And I think that I hope 100% of the people in this room will agree with me that there is a table in this room.
I agree.
Right? There you go. But if we were to take a statement of morality, like, is it wrong to kill an unborn fetus? Now, I wonder how many people will agree, and I wonder how many people will agree because of something they feel rather than something they were taught. So if you have to be taught that there is something wrong, then is it really something you sense or something you just memorized? So the second point I'd like to quickly bring up would be that even if we needed morality as a human species, and we desperately needed it because we were killing each other, and we had this thanatos as the death urge, as some philosophers may call it, that leads us to violence, and I agree with it that there is some urge that comes from our distant past, then the universe still wouldn't owe us that morality, just like the universe doesn't owe us a meaning that I hear a lot of Christians and religious people talk of, this meaning that you need in your life. Where is that meaning? Well, it doesn't owe us a meaning, and it doesn't owe us a morality.
Do you want to go maybe respond another briefly? 30
Do you want me to
again?
respond?
No, I mean, for each of
Would
us
you
to
like to
respond
respond?
again.
Would you like to
Is that all right?
respond?
30
Yeah.
seconds.
Please.
So I think, though, that you talked about, well, is it wrong to kill fetuses, right, to abort fetuses, right? And I think, again, this goes back to my analogy with the stars, right? If the stars exist outside of my mind, you can then say, well, how many stars are there? Well, I don't think I have to answer that question to affirm that the stars do exist outside of my mind. And if they do, then I can know certain answers are wrong. If someone says there's only four stars that exist, I say, no, I know that's wrong. But then if someone says, well, how many stars are there? I say, I don't know, but I know there's more than 4 stars. And I can know that's true because stars exist outside of our mind, right? So going back to your ethical question, right? You can say, well, what about this ethical situation? What about abortion or this and stuff like that, right? You can say, well, I don't claim to know the answer to all of those things, but I know that certain moral statements are true and wrong. I know, say, torturing babies for fun is wrong. And I know that's true because morality exists, is based on something outside of my mind. Now, then you say, well, what about this ethical situation or that? I can say, well, I don't know necessarily, but that's a separate issue. I know morality exists outside of my mind. It's based on non-physical reality because certain things are definitely wrong and certain things are definitely right.
Can I ask very quickly, how do you know? How do you know that they exist outside of your mind?
Well, like I said before, there's a sense that we have, a knowledge that go, and I think we just all recognize. Now, you might say, well, this is mysterious. I don't understand it. But I would say in the end, we all know that's true. We all know that there's certain things that are wrong and certain things are right, independently of what anybody thinks. And that's why when we go and live our lives and when you see new atheists like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, they don't say, well, those Islamic terrorists, in my opinion, they shouldn't have done that. Or Richard Dawkins doesn't say, well, those Christians, in my opinion, the God of the Old Testament is a bad guy. Just that's how I think. No, he says it's wrong. He says he's the worst character of all fiction, right? He makes these very strong claims that doesn't say it's an opinion. I think that shows what we all really know to be true. And then we can say, well, how do you know? Well, okay, that's a good question. But in the end, we still know it's true.
Okay, so a very quick answer to that for me would be that there's a difference between knowing that there are stars, and you don't know how many, but you know they're there, hundreds of billions, whatever. But there's a difference between knowing that there are stars because our empirical senses tell us to do so, and knowing there is a innate morality. Now, the very innate urge of us to say that this is wrong, that murder is wrong, that murdering babies is even more wrong. This comes from evolutionary responses of our motherly instincts that say, please don't kill the innocent baby. I get that. That it's hard to put that aside for a second and to realize that these are just emotions that are pulling us towards knowing, which is not actually knowing, but feeling and hoping that it's wrong because we feel that way. Now, if Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris may say that they shouldn't have done that and that those terrorists, they're horrible human beings, then to be honest, that's their opinion. And when they say they know, they actually don't know, and they may think that way. So even they would be wrong if they were to say they know.
All right. Well, I think we've beaten this horse to death a little bit. So, is there anybody who has any questions directed at Mike? At Mike? Yeah. Sorry. Can I get you to ask a question then?
Mike,
Mm-hmm.
if you think religion is just, let me start again. If you think religion should not impact the creation of laws of politicians who make them, and if religion is just to less valid than politicians who hold any other political ideology?
So if I could summarize, so the question would be, why would politicians which hold one ideology be any different than politicians who hold other ideology? Is that a fair?
And if the first one, if you believe that religion is only an ideology, why shouldn't
Yes.
they have as much say?
So if religion is an ideology, why would they have less say? Okay.
Good question.
Mhm.
What? Yeah. Yeah. Can I get one of you to take the step?
Well, I
Sure.
think it's directed
Oh,
to
it's
you.
just
so you
towards
go
Yeah.
first.
Oh, sorry, Mike. Yep.
Great. And I would make the distinction between philosophical beliefs which are based on that leap of faith that we often talk about when it comes to religion, and ideological beliefs which are based on concrete reasons, which you could talk about. For example, if I want to cite my belief in capitalism, I will say that the free market system has shown itself to be virtuous in the past, or at least successful to a certain degree, and that's why that politician should be allowed to hold that view and to propagate it towards society, while the politician that is a Scientologist should not be allowed to propagate that view, because it has no basis in empirical reality and has no no proven basis towards our lives as we live them.
So
Peter, do you
maybe
wanna-
I can just ask you a question.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure if I fully processed everything you said there, but suppose Martin Luther King Jr. was here today and he said, I'm convinced that all men, all people are equal. Black men, white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics. That they're all equal because they're made in the image of God and their laws should reflect that. And I'm motivated by my religious beliefs. And he says, I want the religious politicians to create a law to reflect that. Would you say, no, you're not allowed to say that? Or what would you say in response?
I would say that they are that he would be allowed to say that. He has the right to say whatever he wants. Right now, should the religious politicians be allowed to reflect that? Well, if the religious reflection of Martin Luther King would ally themselves with moral sentiments that the society holds dear by the negotiation of its members towards a sustainable society, then I would say yes. Not because that religious people say we must all be in God's image and therefore we must all be equal and must be legislated as such, but no, because it will, by reason we can say that by reasoning it out, it will lead to a better society. That's why.
Okay, so we get a little tricky here, though, right? Because you basically said the religious politicians can be motivated by the religious beliefs if the rest of society likes that, right? So, but what if the rest of society is racist and they say, we don't like that, we don't want that law? Would you say, okay, you're right, we can't have a law that creates equality for everybody?
Now, if you look back at the past, let's give it 200 years, well, that's what we had. And I think the law should reflect the society, however racist or immoral as it is. And the evolutional sustainability of that society, if it dies out or not, as many societies, cannibalistic societies had in the past, right, will reflect that judgment upon them. And we don't need a God to reflect judgment upon our society. Now, 200 years ago, when we were racist towards incoming immigrants to Canada, for example, not letting Japanese people come, not letting East Indian people come. Now, our laws actually did reflect that, whether we like it or not, because morality and legislated morality is a reflection of society as a whole. Now, should that be the case? That's a question. In my opinion, yes, it should, however awful the society is. And then, once again, the society will only be its own judge in how successful it will be.
Okay, I have nothing more to say.
Okay. All right, so we have a little bit of time for more questions. Do we have any questions directed at Peter? All right, Ryan?
Peter, I know this is a bit of this might be a bit of a question that demands a longer answer, but I'm just wondering why you think evolution fails to explain morality.
Okay, good. Thank you. That's on my list there.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We got number one there. Evolution explains morality, not God, right? Good. Thank you for asking that, because that's often raised, and so I appreciate having the opportunity to answer that. We should recognize that the origin of a belief, whether it's evolution or whatever else it is, that's a separate issue from what I was raising, right? And to help illustrate this, imagine if we had someone say, my girlfriend is the most beautiful woman in the whole world. Now, you can give an evolutionary explanation of that. You can talk about the propagation of genes, and he's saying that because evolution has programmed him to want to reproduce, and so decided to make him think that this woman is the most beautiful, et cetera, right? But that's a separate question from the one I'm addressing. I want to know is what makes, we can say what makes a statement true. And when he says, my girlfriend is the most beautiful woman in the whole world, that's clearly a subjective belief that's based, the truth of that is based in his mind. There's no reality outside of his mind that makes that true. His girlfriend can exist as a reality outside his mind, right? So we should realize that the origin of this belief is a separate question from the one I'm asking. I'm asking what makes it true? Is it true because of what you think in your mind or something outside of your mind? Now, you could try to strengthen your question or objection. So I want to try to strengthen it a little bit and then respond to that, right? Now you might say, okay, but the genes are the result of evolution, right? And so the genes make him, make our moralities based on our genes. You can go back to that situation with the guy and the girlfriend, or you can go to morality too as well. You can say morality is based on our genes, and our genes are the product of evolution, and so that's the answer to my situation there. But the problem is genes are just physical things. They don't have any moral implications. And morality is fundamentally about how we should behave, not how we do behave, right? To kind of help illustrate this, consider a book that was written called A Natural History of Rape, written by Craig Palmer and Randy Thornhill. And they try to explain why men raped women based on the evolutionary past. And their argument was men want to spread their genes as far and wide as possible, and that's why they rape women. And they said it's in their genes, and this is a result of the evolutionary past. Well, there was an outcry against this because people objected and said, you're justifying rape. You're saying men should rape women. And they said, no. We're not saying how people should behave. We're just explaining how they do behave, right? And I think that's a valid point, right? Genes can explain or help explain how we do behave, but they can't tell us how we should behave. But morality is fundamentally about how we should behave. If we're not talking about shoulds, we're no longer talking about morality. Genes cannot tell us how we should behave. Genes can explain how we do behave, help explain it, but they can't tell us how we should behave. So you can't base morality in genes. Physical things like the chemical components of DNA and genes are physical things, and they can't tell us how we should behave any more than this table or the sun or leaves can ground or form the basis of how we should behave.
Mike?
Yeah, just a quick note. So I would actually argue that in a way, first there has to be a distinction between the individual morality and the societal morality, with the societal morality in a way regulating individual morality in the case of rape or such. And that's why sometimes we have inner urges which are considered taboo for whatever reason, actually for a very certain reason, of the societal norms that can't allow it to go on because that would be at the detriment of the society. But also I would say that genes in some weird way can say what we should do, in the way that genes are passed on throughout successful examples of adaptability. So the people who had genes of a certain nature with certain values of certain morals got passed on throughout a long time, for however long humanity has been around. So clearly those genes have somehow been successful in whatever they do. So in a way that is what we should do, because the genes that weren't successful and had different types of morality died off.
Okay, so can I just ask a question?
Yep.
And hopefully just answer briefly.
Mm-hmm.
If a man has genes that he's inherited that at least encourage him or determine him to rape women, should he rape women?
No, he may do so, and society would need to regulate him out of that.
Okay, but I just want to know let's say he's on an island, there's only one other woman there's no other society. Should he rape that woman?
His genes will tell him yes, and our societal norms will tell him no.
No, he's on a society by himself.
Yeah, so his genes will tell him yes. So the answer to your question, should subjectively he do that? Yes.
He should rape the woman.
Yes, and when I say should, that is for himself. That's
To
not.
decide. He should decide that he should rape that woman.
He can decide, and there will be no one to judge him. Now, he can think in the future. Now, I would say if I was him, right? Evolution has also given us brains to think ahead and to think about the consequences of our action. So even if his genes tell him to rape that woman, I would say, would that man actually do so, knowing that that woman may be the only way he's getting out of that island, his only ally, his only friend, and he's alienating that friend. So other...
But if he
other,
thinks he
one
should,
sec.
that's...
other needs may be more important than his genes in that example.
Okay, but if in his estimation, suppose there's a boat that only fits one person, he rapes her, then he leaves her, it's in his interest, should he still do it, if his genes are programming or telling him to do that?
I think we should probably get away from this exact example. It's getting a little specific and
All right,
everything.
well, why don't we just move on to another question?
I think that might be a good one. Is there anybody in the back who would like to ask a question? Yes, you were there.
I just want to get that Mike's brain a little. For your morality, do you think it serves a purpose, like for individual or for society? And can you elaborate on what you think will sustain morality? Does that also serve the individual or society? Like how does it work?
So I think the question was directed at Mike, and it was a little bit more asking, like, could you explain or expound a little bit more on sustained morality, and is that just kind of your opinion, or where does this kind of sustained morality come from?
And I think a part of the question was also for the distinction between the individual and society. And I think sustained morality would help both in the way that what could it be like? What would a sustainable morality be? Well, for example, if I want to see a world which has no poverty, then I will lead my business practices in the way that my employees are treated fairly, and that's business practice will be sustainable, not only for those employees, but also for the business, because there will be positive benefits in the employees being happy, right? So I am making myself richer with that business, which will be very successful, and also I'm making society richer with a business that will make better and happier human beings. So that would be an example of that sustainable morality that doesn't need any deity to exist, right?
Peter, any comments?
Sure. Although I realized we didn't do our 5-minute closing thing, but we'll do it at the end of the Q&A,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Okay, so we just leave time for that. So I think I understand a little bit more what you mean by sustainable morality, and I think it's basically comes down to what promotes the flourishing of all human beings. Although other atheists take a different view, like Sam Harris talks about the flourishing of all conscious creatures. But I think we should also realize that there's just a lot of different people who see different goals in morality. Someone who, the Secular Humanist Manifesto that many atheists signed a few decades ago talked about the flourishing of all human beings. Sam Harris talks about the flourishing of conscious creatures. Other people say it should be the flourishing of a particular race. Other people say it's the flourishing of a particular ethnicity. The Aryans, white people in Germany, believed it was about the flourishing of the Aryan race. In Japan in the early 20th century, it was about the flourishing of Japanese society. Other people can say, well, no, a sustainable society is about the flourishing of my tribe or my clan. And in the end, a psychopath could say, no, it's the flourishing of myself. That's what it comes down to. So lots of people can have different ideas of what morality should aim towards, right? For you, it's a sustainable society. For other people have very different ideas. But I think we all know inside that someone who, say, a psychopath and believes morality is about his flourishing, usually it's his, is just wrong, like just wrong. And I think everybody here knows that. And so I think if you're saying that morality is based in people's minds, then I think all I would say is just submit to the views of the people in the audience and say, I think we all know that's not true inside. And if you're like me and you think that's just not true, that morality just doesn't come down to what people think in their minds, it's not just their ideas about what the goal of morality is, whether it's a particular ethnic group or conscious creatures, then I think you have to ground it in something outside of your mind, and the physical world won't do that. You need a non-physical reality. And then if there is this non-physical reality, this God that exists, it becomes really important to know, who is this God? Why did he make me? What is this life all about?
Okay, Mike, do you want to respond?
So I think it's important to make the case for how do we decide whose flourishing is more important, the psychopaths, the ISIS flourishing, the societal flourishing, or the human race flourishing. Well, I would think that since we're the humans are the only species that can reason about our morality, then we should, in our own self-interest, promote the flourishing of the human race as a whole. I think that would make sense for most people. Now, what do we do with those psychopaths, and what do we do with ISIS that care about the flourishing of evil societies? Well, I would say that that's why you have the UN, for example, to regulate different types of flourishing that is detrimental towards the human race as a whole, that will take us back to the dark ages, that will see psychopaths kill whoever they want in the manner portrayed in, for example, American Psycho, right? So there should be organizations such as the UN which regulate this. That's my opinion. And that's how we decide whose flourishing is more important, the human races, right?
So maybe I'll just, because he started, so I'll just finish off.
Could we get like, I just want to finish up soon. So could we do like one quick back and forth maybe?
Okay, but can I,
Yeah.
because we're going,
Yeah,
he
yeah,
started,
yeah,
then,
yeah,
and
keep
then
back
so
and forth,
just- So I think you're talking about determining what is right and wrong, and like I pointed out before, that's a separate question. First, we have to decide what makes morality true, and then it's a second question to decide what is the right morality. And also, it's a separate question to decide who or what enforces this morality, right? That's also a separate question. Is it the UN, or is it individual police force, and how do they do that, and stuff like that. So those are good questions, but I just say those are secondary questions to the more fundamental question or issue that I was raising.
Sure, and I agree with that. And the question to who does it, for example, the UN or some other organization, I totally agree with. But to the question of is it do we promote flourishing or not? Well, I think most people would agree, including atheists and religious people, that we promote some type of flourishing. And the real question would be what kind. And since humans are the only species that can reason in such a way and can pose forward that question, I think it should be the flourishing of the human race.
Okay. All right. Well, I think actually we're pretty much at our time for questions. Sorry, I know everybody has like burning questions and everything at this point in time because we got into it pretty deep. But I'd like to invite our speakers to about 5 minutes of closing questions, or sorry, closing arguments. And who would like to go first?
Since I started, I think it's fair for Peter to go.
I don't mind you going.
No, please.
You started. Usually, the person who starts doesn't finish, right?
Cameron, you can decide.
So isn't that right?
Heads or tails?
No, but it usually works to say like a debate. The person who starts doesn't finish, right? So
It's whichever one you want.
Mike, why don't you go ahead and then I'll finish. That's the usual way of doing it.
Okay, sure. If whatever way you like, it's okay. So I'd like to finish off. Sorry, let me just put on my timer. There we go. Okay, so I'd like to finish off with two little anecdotes. One which I just saw this morning and that touched me in such a way that I think will help people understand my points of view. So today when I was coming to university, I live in North York, for example, so it takes me an hour and a half to get here. I was coming on a bus and I saw, first of all, horrible weather, horrible wind, horrible rain at some point. And there was this guy coming out of the bus which I was on, and he had a stroller. He's a he's a father. It was a little baby, maybe 2 years old. Now, what touched me the most was, first of all, something disturbed me very much, which is that stroller fell down, flipped on its head with the baby inside. Now, it was fully loaded with produce, with foodstuff, and all the stuff fell out. Now, one thing that really elevated me as a person and made me so happy for the human race was that I saw 4 men right away, men, not women, running towards him to help him. And you would say, oh, it's maternal, the maternal instinct. Well, they're not mothers, and they're all men. I can't say which religious denomination, of course, because I just saw it out of the bus. But they all rushed in to help him. 2 grabbed his bags. One helped him to pull that. The stroller up to make sure the baby was all right, to make sure everything was all right. And I would have to ask everybody in this audience, do you think this type of action would need to come from religious human beings and from a religious morality? And can there be a subjective morality in each one of us that would say that's for your own good to help that baby out, to help that man out, and we should all do that, regardless of what we believe about the universe and metaphysics? So should we do that? Can there be a person who says that, no, we shouldn't do that? No, in my opinion, I don't think that there would be one person in the audience that would say no to that. The second point I'd like to bring up was, I saw some of your talks on YouTube, Peter, and I'm a big fan, of course. And,
thank you.
and one point that I saw you propagate is the idea that a worshiper or a person who doesn't worship the most perfect being that can never be is committing the most horrible of crimes, right? His morality is twisted upside down, and he's committing a horrible sin, right? And you said it's as bad as Stalin or Hitler. Now, I would slowly put myself into a religious person's shoes and say that, if that was the truth. So if that was indeed the case, that we are horrible people or we are committing a horrible sin towards God as atheists, then I would ask myself, do I want to live in a society? Do I want to live in a society where thought crime about what I believe and worship is somehow worse than the genocide of millions of people? And my answer, even if I was a religious person, if that was indeed the case and that was my objective morality that I would have to believe in because my priest told me as such, then I would ask myself, do I want to live in that society? And the answer is no, I would rather kill myself.
Well, interesting. Okay. Peter, do you have a response to that?
Well,
And any of your closing
My
statements?
sure. Well, Mike, I'm glad to hear that you're a fan. I didn't know that I had atheist fans out there, so that's very exciting for me to hear. And so I'd like to explain a little bit of what Mike brought up there. I have a video online that explains that more fully, but let me do a little bit here. I wanted to kind of explain how serious it was when we failed to worship God. And in order to explain this, there are two moral principles that we can lay out. One of them is that it's thanks, praise, and honor should be given where it is due. And when we don't give those, we're doing something wrong. So, for example, if someone buys you a coffee, you should thank them. And if you don't thank them, you're doing something wrong. It might be a small wrong, but it's still a wrong. You should also honor people as they deserve. So the president of the university, a professor of a class, a prime minister, or a leader of a nation deserves the appropriate amount of honor. Not too much, not too less. And if you don't give them the right amount, you're doing something wrong. Also, praise should be given where it's due. If you go to a concert and someone sings beautifully, then it's appropriate to clap afterwards. And if you refuse to clap, you're doing something wrong. So the first moral principle says that thanks, honor, and praise should be given where it's due. And the second moral principle, though, says that the seriousness of a moral wrong is dependent on not just the act committed, but the type of being that it's done against. So consider killing a mosquito or something like the Ebola virus. Is that a bad thing? Well, it's probably actually a good thing to kill a mosquito maybe, or especially like some dangerous virus that could kill lots of people. But what about killing a horse or a dog? Is that a good thing? Well, it's probably a bad thing, but it's not bad the way killing an innocent human being is bad. So what can we learn from that? We have the same act committed, but the seriousness of that moral wrong is dependent upon the type of being that it's done against. So let's apply this to God, assuming that God exists, but I think that's a good thing to believe, especially based upon some of the reasons I gave here today. Assuming this God exists, if God is the source of every good thing that we have, then he deserves our greatest thanks. If he is not just a nice singer, but the most fantastic being in all of existence, he deserves our highest praise. And I say he, but God is genderless, but we use the word he. If he is the leader not just of a university or nation, but the leader of every created being, he deserves the highest honor. When we fail to thank, honor, and praise him as he deserves, we are doing something wrong. And if we remember that the seriousness of a moral wrong is dependent upon the type of being it's done against, God being a being of infinite value and infinite worth, when we fail to give him what he is due, I think it's safe to say that's an infinite wrong. And that's why I would say all of us have failed to worship God as he deserves. Not just people of other religions. Myself and every single Christian that's ever lived have failed to worship God as he deserves. And therefore, we are far more evil than we can possibly imagine. And if God really does exist, we are in big, big trouble. But the good news is, the Christian message is, that God is not only just, but that he also loves us. He loves us more than we can possibly imagine. And because of his great love for us, even though we have committed this infinite wrong, he has made a way for us to be forgiven. And that forgiveness is possible because his son, Jesus Christ, a being who had infinite value and worth because he was also God, died on the cross, and the punishment that we deserved was placed upon him. A being of infinite value died in our place and makes up for the infinite wrong that we have committed. And that is the good message, the gospel of Christianity. And that is what I am excited about in life. I am convinced that this is true. I am convinced that someone who examines the evidence objectively and fairly will see that Christianity makes more sense and it's more rational than any other religion or worldview out there. And because I'm convinced that is true, I urge you and I invite all of you to accept this free offer of forgiveness, of grace and mercy. Change your life around, love the one true and living God, and worship him as he deserves. Thank you.
Very impassioned plea. Give everybody a round of applause, please. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to say thank you guys very much for coming. Alexa has a few final words, but I just want to make a personal plea for everybody who wants to continue this conversation to come out to the Prenup Pub tonight. Okay? So I'll give it over to the
And a big
MC.
round for Cameron for being a good moderator.
Thanks, Cameron.
Details?
Yep, so like Cameron said, we'll be going to the Prenup Pub, but for the next 15 minutes or so, Mike and Peter will be staying up at the front here, so if you have any further questions, then you can come down and continue the conversation here.
Bring it on. We're excited.
I mean, like, you can come down afterwards and just have like an informal discussion, yeah. And yeah, then we'll be heading over to the Prenup Pub. So when we do go, I'd encourage you to sit and talk with someone with a different perspective so you can like learn, expand your thinking, be challenged in that. And just for anyone who doesn't know, Prenup is just east of College and St. George Street on the south side of College. So if you're heading down St. George Street, south on St. George, turn left on College, and it's on the south side of the street. So thank you everyone for coming out tonight, and looking forward to continuing the discussion at Prenup.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Been a great conversation.
I think it was really good.
Very
I think it
interesting
wasn't too complicated. I think people enjoyed it.
I hope so.
Cameron, I think it went great.
And thanks, Cameron. Great job. You
You did a good job.
did a better
Appreciate
job than the Trump debate moderators.
that. You had a debate about Trump?
I'm referring to the the moderators.